It's hard to believe some of the things that were totally normal in the 1960s would make jaws drop today. Back then, safety and health were more like suggestions. From smoking on airplanes to letting kids roam wild without a seatbelt in sight, everyone was a bit too relaxed. Today we're diving into 20 things that are no longer allowed. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to Those Wonder Years and let us know in the comments, which of these totally safe activities do you actually miss? Get ready to raise an eyebrow or two. This list is a blast from a much riskier past. Smoking on airplanes.
Without the nicotine habit say their fellow flyers should skip their cigarettes, especially on short flights.
Imagine stepping onto a plane, finding your seat, and then lighting up a cigarette right there in the cabin. Sounds wild, right? But in the 1960s, smoking on airplanes wasn't just allowed, it was practically expected. Smokers puffed away, filling the cabin with a thick haze that, let's be honest, was far from fresh air. Flight attendants even handed out free cigarettes. Remember when brands like Marlboro had that slick jet set appeal? In-flight smoking ads made it look glamorous, part of that golden age of flying. But for everyone on board, it was a bit like being trapped in a smoky lounge 30,000 feet above ground. Imagine those tiny airplane bathrooms full of smoke. No wonder people got used to breathing through their sleeves. As the years rolled on and people wised up to the dangers of secondhand smoke, airlines slowly started phasing out in-flight smoking. By the late 80s, most flights in the US were smoke-free zones. Now, the no smoking light is just part of the routine safety check. Can you imagine the uproar if smoking was allowed today? It's safe to say this one is gone for good, but for those who remember, it's a reminder of a time when flying felt a little more unfiltered, dumping garbage in rivers and lakes. Believe it or not, before the environmental movement took off, dumping garbage in rivers, lakes, and even oceans was pretty common. Imagine families enjoying a picnic by the water, only to toss their trash right into the river afterward. It sounds crazy now, but back in the 60s, there was a lot less awareness about pollution or where trash actually went once it left sight. This was before we saw photos of oil-slick ducks or the infamous Cuyahoga River fire of 1969. That's right, this Ohio River actually caught fire due to the high levels of industrial waste floating in it. The idea of out of sight, out of mind was very real, and the rivers and lakes bore the brunt of it. But by the late 60s, the environmental movement was picking up steam, and shocking images of polluted waters began to make headlines. The message was clear. Our trash wasn't disappearing. It was piling up where we swam, fished, and drank. Today, the idea of dumping trash in nature would spark outrage, but back then it was just another day. If only they'd known how much we'd have to clean up after them. Burning trash in the backyard. Back in the 60s, there was a certain charm to taking care of business right in your backyard. Whether it was grilling burgers, hanging laundry, or burning trash. Families often had burn barrels or pits where they tossed paper, plastic, and just about anything else that would go up in flames. Think of it as the ultimate DIY waste disposal method. Kids would stand around watching the flames and probably breathing in some serious chemicals as mom or dad lit a match and sent the week's garbage up in smoke. It sounds a bit like a horror movie scene today, but back then it was just part of life. No need to sort the recyclables, no need to worry about emissions. Just light it up and let the ash fall where it may. The Clean Air Act and waste management regulations eventually made backyard burn barrels a thing of the past, as awareness about air pollution and toxic fumes grew. Imagine seeing a neighbor burning their trash today. You'd probably call the fire department. But for those who grew up with it, backyard burns are a smoky, nostalgic reminder of a time when handling waste was as simple as a box of matches. Unfiltered cigarette ads on TV.
I know what I like, and I like Pall Mall.
If you grew up in the 60s, you probably remember those cigarette ads playing during your favorite shows, with slogans like "Come to Marlboro Country" or "You've come a long way, baby." Cigarette companies didn't just sell smokes, they sold cool, rebellion, and a sense of sophistication. Doctors, athletes, and even cartoon characters endorsed cigarettes on screen, making smoking look like the ultimate adult move. It was a golden age of advertising when brands could say practically anything to get you hooked. Imagine your favorite show being interrupted by an ad featuring a cowboy taking a drag, all while encouraging you to join him in his carefree, smoke-filled world. These ads didn't hold back, and they made smoking look downright glamorous. But by the 1970s, the health risks associated with smoking couldn't be ignored. A major cultural shift led to the 1971 ban on cigarette ads on TV and radio in the US. Imagine those classic shows with ads like that today. Hard to picture, right? For those who watched them, it's a reminder of a time when advertising pushed the limits, selling not just a product, but an image that's since gone up in smoke, using mercury thermometers and toys. Before we knew better, mercury was practically a household staple. Thermometers, blood pressure devices, and even kids' science kits came with that fascinatingly shiny liquid metal inside. And yes, kids loved playing with it. It looked like something out of science fiction, smooth, silvery, and mysteriously liquid. Have you ever tried to pick up mercury with your fingers? In the 60s, many kids did just that as parents looked on, none the wiser. Mercury spills were handled casually with little understanding of how dangerous exposure actually was. Over time, however, people started realizing the serious health risks, especially after seeing cases of mercury poisoning. Schools and homes gradually phased out anything with mercury, and by the 2000s, safer digital thermometers had mostly replaced the old glass kind. These days, mercury is tightly regulated, and the idea of having kids play with it is terrifying. But back in the day, it was just another curious science experiment. For those who remember, mercury thermometers are a relic of a time when science seemed magical, right up until it wasn't. No speed limits on rural roads. Imagine driving down a long, winding country road in the 60s. Windows down, the open road stretching endlessly ahead, and no speed limit in sight. That's right, on many rural roads, you could go as fast as you wanted. Some drivers took it easy, while others treated it like their own personal racetrack. The absence of speed limits wasn't just about freedom, it was almost an invitation to push the boundaries, with cars roaring down back roads at whatever speed felt right. Have you ever imagined a time when fast enough was decided by the driver? Rural areas, especially in the US, had an attitude of independence that trickled down to the roads too. But as traffic safety concerns grew, speed limits began to appear everywhere, particularly after studies showed how dangerous high-speed crashes could be. Now, rural roads are as regulated as any other, and the days of anything goes driving are long gone. Looking back, it's almost shocking to think about, but for those who lived it, it's a nostalgic reminder of a wilder, more carefree approach to the road. Selling candy cigarettes for kids. Back in the 60s, candy cigarettes were a huge hit with kids, and parents thought nothing of it. These sugary treats were designed to look just like real cigarettes, complete with realistic packaging and a white, chalky exterior that you could blow on to make a little smoke puff. They were seen as harmless fun, a way for kids to feel like grown-ups, imitating mom or dad as they puffed away. Can you imagine the outcry if candy cigarettes hit shelves today? But back then, they were everywhere. Grocery stores, candy shops, even vending machines. The concept wasn't seen as a problem until society became more aware of the health risks associated with smoking. People realized that normalizing cigarette-like habits for kids might actually influence their future choices. By the late 20th century, candy cigarettes had mostly disappeared, and today they're more of a retro curiosity than an actual treat. For those who remember, candy cigarettes are a sugary reminder of a time when imitation was seen as innocent fun, even if it raised a few eyebrows later on. Unsupervised trick-or-treating.
W-double-E-N spells Halloween.
Halloween in the 1960s was a different kind of spooky. Kids would grab their costumes, say goodbye to their parents, and roam the neighborhood in groups, collecting candy until their bags were bursting, all without a single adult in sight. It was a night of pure freedom, where older kids took charge of the younger ones, and parents only expected them back when they'd had their fill. Can you imagine a Halloween where kids are let loose like that? The community atmosphere was strong, and people didn't think twice about opening their doors to costumed kids roaming the streets. As times changed and parents became more cautious, trick-or-treating evolved into a more supervised event. Today, the idea of unsupervised trick-or-treating is almost unheard of, with many families opting for safe, organized events instead. But for those who grew up in the 60s, Halloween night was a thrilling adventure, a little slice of independence wrapped up in costumes and candy. Lead gasoline at every pump. In the 1960s, filling up your tank meant pumping in gasoline laced with lead, a common practice that, at the time, seemed completely normal. Leaded gasoline was prized for its ability to improve engine performance and reduce knocking, and it was available at every gas station across the country. Little did people know they were breathing in toxic fumes with every tank. Imagine the irony of adding a harmful element to fuel without realizing its long-term effects. The harmful impacts of lead on health and the environment weren't widely recognized until the late 70s, when studies linked lead exposure to a host of serious health issues. By the 1980s, leaded gasoline was phased out and eventually banned in most parts of the world. Today, it seems absurd to think that every drive contributed to lead exposure, but for those who remember the smell of gasoline in the 60s, it's a reminder of a time when science was still catching up with industry. Parents smoking around kids. Picture this, it's family movie night in the 1960s, and while the kids munch on popcorn, mom and dad casually light up cigarettes in the living room. Smoking indoors, even around kids, was just part of life back then. Parents smoked in the car, at the dinner table, and even in their children's bedrooms without a second thought. It sounds shocking today, but back then, smoking was so normalized that it didn't raise eyebrows. Kids grew up surrounded by secondhand smoke, and it wasn't until years later that the dangers of passive smoking became widely known. Studies in the 70s and 80s revealed just how harmful secondhand smoke is, especially for children, leading to major social and legal shifts. These days, smoking around kids is frowned upon, and smoke-free environments are the standard. For those who grew up in the 60s, though, it's a reminder of a time when society was blissfully unaware of what they were breathing in, a part of childhood that's unthinkable now. Corporal punishment at home and school. In the 1960s, corporal punishment was as common as recess. Teachers kept paddles within reach, and parents weren't shy about a quick smack to keep their kids in line. If you misbehaved at school, there was a good chance your teacher would handle it on the spot with a firm lesson you wouldn't forget. Imagine sitting in class, knowing that misbehavior could end with a trip to the principal's office, and a paddle waiting for you there. For many kids, the threat alone was enough to keep them in line. At home, spare the rod, spoil the child was the unspoken rule, and physical punishment was just part of discipline. As society began to view child welfare differently, this method of discipline became less acceptable, eventually being banned in most schools by the 80s and 90s. Today, corporal punishment is a controversial subject, with many seeing it as an outdated, even harmful approach. For those who grew up with it, however, it's a reminder of an era when discipline was strict, immediate, and not up for negotiation. Schoolyard games with dangerous equipment. In the 60s, playgrounds were built to challenge kids' agility and nerves. Metal slides, dizzying merry-go-rounds, tall monkey bars, and seesaws that launched you if you weren't careful were all part of the playground experience. Picture this, kids swinging high on metal chains, landing hard on gravel or asphalt if they fell. It sounds rough today, but back then it was all part of the fun. The thrill of climbing a tall slide or balancing on the seesaw gave kids a taste of adventure and a few bruises along the way. Safety regulations, not so much. If you got hurt, you shook it off or wore the bruise as a badge of honor. Eventually, concerns about injuries and child safety led to the removal of risky playground equipment, replaced by softer surfaces and lower slides. Today's playgrounds are designed with safety in mind, but for those who grew up in the 60s, playgrounds were a wild adventure. It's a reminder of a time when playgrounds were made to test your limits, not keep you comfortable. Swimming in unregulated public pools. In the 1960s, swimming pools were a summer staple, but regulations and sanitation standards weren't exactly strict. Imagine jumping into a public pool with only a hope and a prayer that the water was clean enough. Chlorine levels? Testing? Not so much. Lifeguards might or might not be on duty, and hygiene rules were relaxed. Pools were often crowded with kids who hadn't showered, sunscreen floating on the surface, and a mixture of grass and dirt inevitably trailed in. It was all part of the experience. Parents didn't think twice about sending their kids to the local pool without adult supervision, trusting they'd stay safe while splashing around. In the 80s and 90s, however, stricter public health standards changed the way pools were maintained. Today, regulations ensure water quality, lifeguard coverage, and hygiene standards are upheld. But for those who remember swimming in the wild west of public pools, it's a nostalgic reminder of carefree summer days when a little murkiness never hurt anyone, right? Advertising alcohol during family TV shows.
Open a beer, what do you hear?
In the 60s, watching TV as a family meant tuning into shows sponsored by popular beer or liquor brands. It wasn't unusual to see ads for whiskey, beer, or cocktails during primetime family programming. Picture this, kids watching their favorite show, only to see an ad break with a slick voiceover recommending the latest whiskey. To viewers, it was normal, and no one thought twice about it. Alcohol was part of the culture, and advertising it to family audiences wasn't controversial. Parents watched with a drink in hand, and the idea of family-friendly didn't exclude a little spirit or two. As attitudes toward advertising to young audiences shifted, regulations began to limit alcohol ads during family hours, leading to tighter controls on what could be shown. Today, alcohol ads are restricted to specific hours, but for those who grew up with these commercials, it's a reminder of a time when the line between adult and family content was a bit blurry. Openly hunting and fishing without licenses. In the 1960s, hunting and fishing were common pastimes, often passed down through generations. Many people simply grabbed their gear, headed to the woods or lakes, and spent the day outdoors. Licenses and strict regulations? Not so much. Imagine fathers taking their kids out for their first hunt, sharing stories, and teaching them the basics, all without a permit in sight. It was a simpler time, where nature felt like everyone's playground. Rules around catch limits, hunting seasons, and conservation weren't as strict, and the mentality was more about if you can catch it, you can keep it. Over time, conservation efforts led to regulations requiring licenses, permits, and seasonal limits to protect wildlife. Today, licenses and strict rules ensure the protection of fish and game, but for those who grew up in the 60s, outdoor adventures were unregulated, free, and wide open. It's a nostalgic reminder of a time when nature felt a little closer to home. Driving without car seats for kids. In the 1960s, car rides were a family affair, but safety looked a lot different back then. Car seats for kids, practically unheard of. Young children often rode in the front seat or sprawled across the back without a seatbelt in sight. Babies were even held on a parent's lap or nestled in a makeshift setup that wouldn't pass today's safety checks. Imagine a road trip where safety first meant holding onto your kid tightly if you hit a bump. It sounds shocking now, but back then it was simply the norm. When car seats eventually entered the scene, they were more about keeping kids from wandering around the car than actual crash protection. As car safety awareness grew, regulations changed, making car seats mandatory and more secure. Today, buckling up a child is automatic, but for those who grew up in the 60s, it's a nostalgic reminder of a time when car rides were a little wilder and a lot less regulated, using lawn darts, jarts for outdoor games. Lawn darts, or jarts, were a backyard game that combined fun with a touch of danger. These large weighted darts had sharp metal tips and were thrown towards a target circle on the ground. Imagine kids and adults alike tossing these heavy projectiles across the yard, hoping for the perfect bullseye and praying no one wandered into the path. Lawn darts became wildly popular for parties and family gatherings, where everyone joined in without a second thought about the risks. Over time, however, injuries became all too common, leading to hospital visits and even fatalities. By the late 1980s, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission stepped in, banning the sale of lawn darts due to safety concerns. Today, the idea of letting kids play with these oversized, sharp-tipped toys sounds absurd. For those who remember, though, lawn darts were just another part of the backyard fun, a reminder of an era when safety wasn't always part of the equation. Widespread use of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. In the 1960s, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, were everywhere. Hairspray, air conditioners, refrigerators. These chemicals made modern life more convenient, but their impact on the ozone layer was largely unknown. Imagine spraying your hair every morning without a clue that those convenient CFCs were harming the planet. CFCs weren't just popular, they were practically a symbol of the times. From perfectly styled hairdos to cool, air-conditioned homes, they improved daily life, so much so that they became essential. But as scientists discovered CFC's harmful effects on the ozone, attitudes began to change. In the 1970s and 80s, environmental awareness sparked global efforts to phase out CFCs, culminating in the Montreal Protocol. Today, most CFCs have been banned, and the ozone is gradually healing. For those who grew up with these miracle chemicals, it's a reminder of a time when convenience came first and environmental impact came later. Hospital ashtrays and smoking rooms. In the 1960s, even hospitals weren't smoke-free. Patients, doctors, nurses, everyone could smoke in designated areas or right in their hospital rooms. Imagine recovering from surgery, only to find the person in the next bed lighting up. It sounds absurd today, but smoking in hospitals was considered normal. Ashtrays lined waiting rooms and no smoking signs were rare. Smoking was so normalized that it took years before hospitals began restricting it. It wasn't until the late 70s and 80s that the medical community acknowledged the irony of allowing smoking in health facilities, leading to smoke-free policies. Today, hospitals are strictly non-smoking zones, a far cry from the days of in-room ashtrays. For those who remember, it's a reminder of a time when smoking was so ingrained in daily life that not even hospitals were off limits, regularly drinking unfiltered tap water. In the 1960s, tap water was trusted without question, flowing freely from faucets without the filtration standards we rely on today. There was no bottled water industry, and home filtration systems were practically non-existent. Imagine filling a glass of water from the tap without ever wondering about contaminants. It sounds simple, but tap water back then often contained pollutants, chemicals, and bacteria that we'd avoid today. The Clean Water Act of 1972 brought stricter regulations, ensuring safer public water, and home water filtration later became popular. Today, many people prefer filtered or bottled water, but for those who remember, drinking straight from the tap was part of everyday life, a reminder of a time when convenience often came before caution. The 1960s may feel like a different world, but these once normal practices are a reminder of just how much things have changed. From backyard burned barrels to unfiltered tap water, it's clear we've come a long way, but just because these things are gone doesn't mean they're forgotten. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to Those Wonder Years and let us know in the comments, which of these risky 60s habits would you actually bring back? Let's keep the nostalgia alive, one banned habit at a time.